Everyone, it seems that we are online, that our broadcast is starting, and it's a big pleasure for me and for us that we are now launching like this first tobacco control talk of the World Federation of Public Health Associations. And as it's the first one, I would like to tell you a little bit about these talks. These talks should be like a regular series where we are always inviting one leading international tobacco control expert, and where we are talking about one selected tobacco control issue. So we try to make these talks educational, inspiring, interesting, and just also useful for tobacco control researchers and for tobacco control advocates from all over the world. And for this first tobacco control talk, it's a big pleasure and privilege that we could convince Michael Moore to be our first global expert for this lecture series. And I think you are an expert who actually does not really need an introduction, but nevertheless, for some people who might not know you, you are the past president of the World Federation of Public Health Associations, and you're currently also a Rotary International District Governor. And you are active at several research institutions like the George Institute for Global Health, the University of Canberra in Australia, and the University of Technology in Sydney. And I think what is very interesting, also related to the topic we are talking about today, is that you also have been a Minister of Health in Australia, and namely the first independent one in whole of Australia. And based on your many achievements, in 1917, you've also been appointed as a member of the Order of Australia, which is a big honor in your country, of course. And there are many, many other activities and positions I did not mention now, I think, but these were the main ones. And I'm very glad that you are taking your time and be ready for this discussion today.
Yeah, thanks, Lawrence. Good to be here. It's good to be here, and it's such an important topic in terms of people's health. And you know, the response worldwide has been variable, and so I think we can learn lessons from each other.
Yes, I'm pretty sure. And yeah, and I would like to start with this question then, because you are in a very unique position, because many public health experts are either researchers or they are practitioners. Some of them were working in health policy, and you were actually a Minister of Health in Australia, and you were just finishing your PhD on public health advocacy actually, and you were doing health policy. So you've been very different positions. So I think you have a unique perspective of advocacy. Can you tell us about how was your perspective of working as a politician, but also in policy making, and now as a researcher, because you might see it from different perspectives than many of us are doing it?
Well, actually, my engagement in politics and public health started quite early after I was elected. My original career was as a school teacher. But what I was involved in very early was illicit drug policy and prostitution. And that actually drove me to go, I needed more understanding, and I went back to university while I was in politics and did a master's in public health. It was that master's in public health, that learning going parallel to what I was doing in politics, that made me ensure that I was actually basing what I was saying on evidence, which is in marked contrast to some of our political leaders we see at the moment who just say things, and even when I think they know they're not true. But it became very important to me to ensure that we had evidence, that I had sensible evidence. And so that also added to credibility. I think with regard to tobacco, I have a little story to tell. It was when I became a minister, one of the tobacco companies approached me and said, "Can we have a meeting?" And I thought, well, if I say no, they'll run a whole lot of media saying, look, he wouldn't even meet with us. So I said, no, you can come, but actually also get your colleagues, because I'm going to have one meeting only with tobacco generally. And they arrived in my office. Of course, a very attractive, young, very smart lawyer was the lead there. And they had the proposal to talk about young people, because what they wanted to do was to put money in and actually run a program on getting youth to stop smoking. And so this came out after 15 minutes, and I said, and what is the main message there? And they said, well, the main message will be that you can't smoke until you're an adult. Well, a few years earlier, I'd been a high school teacher. I cannot think of a faster way to get a 17-year-old to start smoking than to tell them they can't smoke until they're an adult, 18. And so it was very clear. And we'll probably come back and talk about youth and smoking, because I think it's a really important topic, and there's been very good research done on that. But it was very interesting that the method that they used was to come into a politician's office trying to build a relationship and make sure that relationship could then be used. So give something that was useful to me, money, to do something that I wanted to do was actually to reduce smoking amongst young people. So they were working very hard to find the middle ground, if you like. When the meeting fell apart was when I said, look, it won't matter who's sitting in this minister's seat. Prior to me, there was a member of the Liberal Party. Prior to that, it was a member of the Labor Party. It doesn't matter who's going to be sitting in this seat when it comes to smoking, because actually our goal for all of us is to put you out of business. And that sort of ended that meeting fairly abruptly, actually. So, but I'd had my meeting, we'd had a discussion, I'd listened and responded, but there were lots of lessons in there for those doing advocacy opposing that, and understanding how clever they are. And we'll go through some of those things later in this discussion, and I'm sure people on the webinar will also have questions through the Q&A thing as well, Florian.
So like one point you said, you were arguing that it's important to build a relationship, that the researchers are building a relationship with the politicians, or?
Well, look, I would say, I would say public health advocates. The researchers are public health advocates.
Yeah.
You can always do your piece of research and have it published and say, that was really good. And actually it is good and it feels good. And hopefully somebody else will take it and use it. But even better is if you take that extra step as a researcher and say, this research is really important as part of influencing people, and then go through a process of the sorts of things that you might use to influence people. And Florian, I do have a slide that on this very issue about how we attempt to influence people, and I'll just bring it up if you can bear with me while I share the screen.
Yes.
And so what we've got here in front of us is these 10 steps for originally change management. In terms of Kotter's change management theory. But these were adapted to be used for advocacy, because what are we trying to do with advocacy? We're trying to change the way people think. And so what your viewers can see on the screen: establish a sense of urgency. Really important, create a guiding coalition. Do not try and do it by yourself. Yes, you're a researcher. Yes, you've got a good idea. Go and find the Public Health Association near you, or ASH, against smoking and, smoke activities on smoking and health, or the Cancer Council or the Heart Foundation. All of these people are working on the same thing. And I think, and you mentioned it before, developing and maintaining influential relationships is really, really important. And, you know, the tobacco companies are great at making sure they can take politicians to the football or out to the theatre or something along those lines, and they can build that sort of relation because they have money. And they're not the only ones. You know, we see alcohol and food industry, pharmaceutical industries, all doing the same thing. But you've got to know what it is that you want to see changed. And, you know, the work of the Public Health Association and some of the great leaders, Mike Daub and Simon Chapman in Australia, when we went for plain packaging of tobacco, before it happened, it was 10 years in the preparation. And as Mike Daub says, you know, overnight success, it takes time. Mm-hmm. And so we work about that, but you also got to communicate your vision. You've got to empower other people to join you. Being opportunistic, these are sequential, except for being opportunistic. You can't make that sequentially. You watch for an opportunity when a politician says something silly and you challenge it, or something like that. A piece of publication comes out such as the one that Emily Banks and others did at the Australian National University, with a huge cohort that showed that 2/3 of people who smoke will die 10 years younger than those who don't. You know, so it was a great thing to anchor your advocacy on. You generate short-term wins, and then there's persistence. You're always persistent. So, look, I just wanted to share those few things with you, so that we could perhaps you have a question there. Go on.
Could you maybe go back to the slide, because I would have some questions to this.
I'd love to.
Because from your unique perspective in this way, can you tell us a bit more about the points? For example, like the one point, maintaining influential relationships. You said this is sometimes easy for the industry because they have money and they invite politicians to football games and things like this. How could advocates establish an influential relationship, or which relationship with which advocates did you have as a politician, and what can others learn from this?
Look, I think what public health advocates have, they don't have money, but they have credibility. Tobacco company has money, but no credibility. So they're trying to get credibility. We already have it. And so it's a matter of actually going and introducing yourself. And if you haven't done it before, you go to your local member of parliament, and you say, look, I want to talk to you about tobacco. And before you go, you know what your clear vision is to number 4. You know what it is that you want to change. In our country, I know in Australia they have plain packaging of tobacco, and it's now in a number of other countries, but we don't have it in Austria. I think I'm correct, Lauren, you do not have it in Austria.
Yes.
And so we don't have it in Austria, and and I really think that we should do it. And this is how it was done there. Here's the research. Do you need anything? How else can I help you? And I think that's the sort of approach. But you have to do it in building that relationship, and you can't do it unless you introduce yourself to the person as well. And you know, especially backbench members of parliament, those who are not in the government, need help. They usually have very poor or very small support in their offices. And so if you can provide, help them write speeches, give them you can't write their speech for them, but you can give them dot points that they might include in their speech. And so I think those things can be very, very helpful. And so that's the way you build the relationships. And but you know, everybody does it slightly differently, because we've all got different personalities, but you can't do it unless you approach somebody.
And another point is because I think many advocates are often public health researchers, so they are like researchers and advocates at the same time. And you were a minister who also had a Master of Public Health, so which is usually not the case. So most politicians don't have a training in research. Which advice would you have like for researchers to make the research more impactful? Should they use like the media, or should they use personal email, or how can you make your research findings valid for public health topics in this way?
Look, if you're a researcher, I think it's a great opportunity to introduce. I'd like to explain my research, and you've got to be able to give it in simple terms. Politicians tend to receive policy documents that have 3 points on the front. These are the 3 points it's making, and then the explanation behind it. And that's where you can put your research. So I would say 3 points on the front, maybe a page of explanation, a sort of page that would go in a press release. And by the way, you can also use it as a press release. And that way it's easy to explain. But the other element, I guess, for a researcher is use those 3 points in Twitter. Use them on Facebook.
Yes.
Because when people read them on Twitter, they think, oh, I better go and have a look at that. Another researcher, better go and have a look at that paper. And then, of course, when they're writing their own paper, they quote yours, which is a big winner for academics as well, apart from the advocacy work that's going on, because it all builds on each other.
And researchers often say that it's very difficult to get the research findings into the media. Would you say, is this the case, or what should researchers do that the research is better accepted by the media, so like that the politicians also read the findings through the newspaper or the TV?
One of the hats that I wear as the chair of the National Drug Research Institute in Australia at Curtin University. And in that institute, we actually have people specifically working on media and social media. And so I think that's happening with more and more academics, because they realize, and academic institutions, because they realize the importance of getting their publications out into the public eye. And they're not just using the traditional media, they're also using social media. And this has become more and more important. And of course, the advent of social media is really after the time I left politics. You know, I left politics nearly 20 years ago. And have been working pretty well since that time in public health. You know, as CEO of the Public Health Association of Australia. And it was that practice of advocacy that was so important that really led me to say, actually, I want to reflect on this. I want to write the PhD on how we go about it. And the the steps you see on your screen are part of that PhD.
Okay.
And as a matter of interest, the PhD thesis is on the World Federation of Public Health Associations website, if somebody wanted to look at it.
Okay. How can people find it? With a search term, or?
Just look in the website of the World Federation of Public Health Associations. It's just WFPHA.org.
Okay. And concerning the points you presented, I have one last question. You also said it's important to create a powerful guiding coalition, because like there are big interests involved in most public health topics. And for example, we know that in Australia, you were very successful as the first country to implement plain packaging. What is a guiding coalition? Which members does it have, and what makes a strong one? So how would you define this? Or what were the experiences in Australia?
First of all, we had great leadership. People like Mike Daub and Simon Chapman and Paul Grogan. There was a run of people from different organisations. So Mike Daub from the Public Health Advocacy Institute, Simon Chapman was from the University of Sydney, but we had the Heart Foundation, we had Action on Smoking and Health, Cancer Council. There was a huge range of organisations, all of whom saw this as important. Of course, the medical associations came on board, the College of Physicians, but people like Mike and Simon had, and the Public Health Association, we were doing the same. We were trying to bring people with us on that. And actually it wasn't hard, because in that case, these organisations understood exactly that every single step you make makes a difference. But the other thing that they all understood was you do not make a difference with one thing. It's always a run of things. And I'd like to tell another little story about Action as Minister. I was responsible for removing tobacco from our pubs and clubs in my own jurisdiction, the Australian Capital Territory. But I could never have done it if it wasn't for the campaigns that had been running beforehand, if we didn't have restrictions on where people could smoke in terms of their offices, in terms of the campuses around hospitals, in public buildings. So those restrictions were already in place and people understood why. And we had these government campaigns running about what smoking does to you. And it's that combination of a whole series of things that works. It's not just putting the regulation in place, because politicians won't do that. They know it'll backfire. And it's no good backfiring and losing your seat, because once you've lost your seat, you can't do anything. So there's an interesting balance there in how you operate, and that sort of support that I had from a huge number of people was really, really important, because when I was criticised by a tobacco front company, the Retailers Association, Smoking Retailers Association, which had only just come into existence because the tobacco company paid them to do it. When you get that criticism, then it's not just me answering it. It was the medical association, the College of Physicians, the Heart Foundation, and so there was constant defence of the action I'd taken, which worked very well.
Okay. And would you say, because there are so many different steps, is there like one most important lesson you can give to public health advocates for being very effective as advocates, or which main lessons would you have for them?
Yeah, I think it's the 3 Ps: persistence, persistence, persistence. And look, that's because in public health we've got an idea, we know what needs to be done. Experience tells us it tends to take 10 years to get there. There are exceptions. We have seen governments responding very rapidly to COVID-19. But for those of us who are involved in infectious diseases in many ways, we knew the sort of actions that needed to be taken already. And one could argue that there was 10 years of preparation to get governments ready to respond to the way they did. Yeah, and some well, some not so well.
And it seems that in Australia you were much more effective than actually most other countries in the world. It's especially concerning tobacco control. How would you explain this? What was different, or what is different in Australia? Do you have more advocates? Do you have better advocates? Do you have more research, a different political system, or how would you explain these big differences?
There's never seems to be one single thing in my answers. Yes, it was great advocates, great work by associations and so forth. But there was something else that happened in Australia, and that is that we have 8 separate jurisdictions, and who are responsible for the main regulation of tobacco. The federal government certainly has some responsibilities about importing and pricing and also running campaigns. But there was competition going on between the states and territories as to who could have the best tobacco policy. And a group of advocates, including the medical associations and the other ones I've named, also produced a set of awards where they would reward the government, would publish an award that would get very wide media as to which jurisdiction was doing best, and the jurisdiction that was going last was given the Dirty Ashtray Award. And I think that work certainly provided motivation for me. And I remember the year that my own jurisdiction was not top. In fact, it had been given to Tasmania, and the reason they gave it to Tasmania because it had been bottom, but it really made a lot of changes to catch up, and so they gave the award there. My bureaucrats were in my office with me, and we were demanding, why is it that we've dropped? Now what are we going to do to get back up to top position? So I think there's different elements that work in different countries. You can extrapolate from another country. You can't just copy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that in developing policies, you learn from other countries, but don't. But in academic terms, don't plagiarize.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when taking like this international perspective, and also we were talking about tobacco companies now, how do you see like the role of FCTC or the Framework Convention of Tobacco Control? How relevant was this for Australia? How relevant do you see it at the moment internationally when it comes to advocacy and also in the relationship to tobacco companies?
Look, the Australian governments, all of them have been very, it doesn't matter which flavour, they have been very strong on tobacco control. Labor has been stronger, and particularly under the leadership of the Minister, Nicola Roxon, in terms of the plain packaging of tobacco, because that was challenged, first of all, in our High Court, which is equivalent to the American Supreme Court. It's our highest court. And then to the WTO, World Trade Organization, a number of times. The government had to put a lot of money in to challenge those. Nicola Roxon was first health minister when she introduced it. Then she became Attorney General. So she was the chief law officer. So she was also the legal officer that defended it, which was sort of an interesting serendipity. But I think that the lessons for other countries were that we had already now been through the World Trade Organization, and we did have the right. Governments do have the right to use plain packaging to provide a healthier set of circumstances. So look, there are a number of issues, but Florian, the other element here is, as I named this first one in the series, is a phoenix rising from the ashes. I think we also need to look at the strategies that tobacco companies have used,
yes,
and what they are using in the future.
Yeah, this fits perfectly like to the first questions we are getting, because we are still live streaming also on Facebook. And Alexandra was asking exactly this question about the tobacco strategy when it comes to e-cigarettes. And you were arguing that big tobacco is like the phoenix arising from the ashes, as you just said. And would you argue that tobacco countries are somehow using the same or similar techniques like they were using in the past? And also in relationship to the youth, or how is the situation differently now than it was in the past years and decades?
Let me share my screen again, and at the moment you can probably see nothing. But we
can see.
That's what they would have us believe, unless, of course, you think that deception, distortion, and dissemblance are lies. Then we might have a different story. So let's look at smoking in youth and the history behind it. So big tobacco, and when they came to see me, and this is the strategy they were using, although this is from an academic paper, and I'll come to that. What they want to do is speak. They don't want to go through government. They want to speak directly to young people. They want to speak directly to parents and youth. And they also like to fund organisations, young people organisations in particular, because that gives them the opportunity to get these sorts of messages out. And the one I mentioned earlier was that it's an adult choice. 16, 17-year-olds are too young to make that choice. And actually the problem, they also want to get the message across. The problem's peer pressure. It's not you, it's your friends putting pressure on you. And the other message was always that it's the law. So the only thing to stop you smoking is the law. Of course you want to smoke. And so that's the sort of message. But what they don't mention are things like that tobacco is addictive, that there are huge harms associated with tobacco, including passive smoking, that they put a huge amount of money and effort into marketing, and they use many other attempts to influence. And so their real purpose in doing this is that not old enough as young people, and it preserves and they want to make sure they have access to young people, because they know that if they can get to young people, then those people tend to continue smoking. And the next thing they want to do is build we are taking action so we don't put regulation in place. And yet the most effective thing in smoking is regulation. And they want to be an ally with the policy makers and the regulators. So and to do this, they diffuse the opposition. So no, we're working with government to get the best possible outcome. And to do this, they want to continue to bolster their credibility as an industry, because it's been so effective. And so Landman and others wrote this up in 2002. These were the tools that were being used by the tobacco industry at that time. And my contention is that we see the same tools being used by e-cigarettes. Actually, before I go to e-cigarettes, I might just talk about industry credibility, because when my colleague Mike Daub heard that I was doing this lecture, he sent me some wonderful material, and I do want to just share that because it's very, very recent, and it is from these looking at the Twitter accounts of these particular companies, and what they want to do is sell how they're so involved in diversity and inclusion. They're wonderful. They have cultural advantage, competitive business, they gender balance, racial diversity, all the things that are that ordinary people see as important. And of course, they want to protect the planet, and they'll put money into it and tackle environmental challenges, climate change, wildlife. There's so many they do. And of course, they partner with authorities, with law enforcement and customs, and look at the handle at Japan Tobacco Science. And their aim, they say, is to inform, educate, and collaborate. Of course, the real aim is marketing and scientific research. They are publishing, and they're paying for people to publish and support. And this will be particularly around e-cigarettes. And they claim they're open and transparent. And of course, they protect human rights. And the whole time this is happening, what we are actually seeing is killing so many people. And so this is what they're trying to get around in terms of their credibility. And I mentioned Emily Banks' work. 2/3 of smokers die a decade earlier than non-smokers. So and yet they still push this sort of credibility issue. And I think that that actually helps to understand how the tobacco industry operates before we go into the issue of e-cigarettes and how the tobacco companies are operating there.
And I would also be interested, because you were also in the position as a politician, how did you experience the tobacco industry? So how did they get in contact with you? How did they influence some information? I think some of the issues you just mentioned, they are public, so every one of us can experience them. But what did you experience as a politician, which we might not know as researchers or public health advocates?
Yeah. Look, I think the more important thing was not so what was happening for me. I think they realized quite early that I was not going to be a person they could influence very easily. And so they moved to, and I had a personal policy of a very limited amount of donation that I would accept. Whereas political parties, now in Australia, our major political parties do not accept donations from tobacco companies. However, one of our parties that is a partner in government at the federal level, the National Party, does still accept donations, large donations from political parties, and some of the independent and crossbench members do as well. I think it's very sad. And so when you give a lot of money, and you're not just giving money to one party, you're giving it, if you believe in one party and their policy and you give some money, I understand that. But that's not what was happening. They give the same amount of money to two major parties. And if we can go back 20 years, that's what they were doing. And that way they're buying influence. That's the only way you can. That's the only way you can see it. So influence through the party and through the members, and they also, of course, do what we're capable of doing, which is make appointments and come and talk and come and talk. And I think that's incredibly important as well. So let me just have a quick look at where I had started, and I think this is another one from my friend Mike Daub. I've mentioned his name a couple of times, so here he is with his plain packaging. But he also provided a copy of this tie to me, and the tie says, "Democracy is not a spectator sport." Now, what a great concept, you know. And look, in America at the moment, and this is an American tie, this is a really, really important issue with the election coming up. But on the back, look who's given it to every member of the Senate, every member of the House of Representatives. It's Philip Morris. So yeah, how do they get to them? You get a great tie with a great idea on it, and then you get that sort of approach. But from e-cigarettes, I think there's a particular interesting area. First of all, there's a tension within public health about this, and they know that. And so there's a tension between treating the individual on the one hand and treating the population on the other hand. So at an individual level, if somebody's tried to give up smoking again and again and again, and everything you've tried and it doesn't work, then you would want to be able to find something for that person, and e-cigarettes might be it. But at a population level, you don't want to make them widely available because they are also harmful. We don't know how harmful they are compared to ordinary tobacco. There's an evidence that they are less harmful. We don't know how much less. And of course, what they use is the term harm reduction. But harm reduction has been picked up from the illicit drug policy thinking and adopted by the tobacco companies. And they have been quite deliberate of leaving out what a good drug policy is, which includes supply reduction and demand reduction. So you're trying to supply reduction, you mostly achieve through price. Your demand reduction, you mostly achieve through treatment. Supply reduction, though, can also be reduced by making a product available in a restricted way. And then you think about harm reduction. So how do you make it available in a restricted way? Well, you do it through pharmacies. But this is not what the e-cigarette companies, which are tobacco companies, it's not what they want. They are trying to get people to use as widely as possible. So they use all of these things. They use Twitter, as we just went through earlier. They use front organisations. They use vicious harassment. Anybody who has been criticised, made any criticism of e-cigarettes will get trolled. Mind you, when I look at the ones that I've been trolled on, and other people have been trolled much worse than I have, they seem to be very, very similar in their approach. So I often wonder how many people are actually involved in the Twitter programs. And look, I know there are some good people. As I said, there's a tension in public health, but I think the tension is a misunderstanding about this move from illicit drug policy here, because illicit drug policy is about controlled availability, not about prohibition. It just makes things worse, but controlled availability. And that's what we need to achieve. And the vicious harassment, our colleague Simon Chapman, I'm sorry I keep using Australian examples, but he says, look, if you're going to be an advocate, grow a rhinoceros hide. And I think it's a terrific thing. And remember, these ones are causing so much concern in the United States, in Australia, because they are looking at young people and are specifically designed at young people, and that is their target. And there's more and more evidence coming out that the people who are using e-cigarettes, particularly young people, also move to smoking tobacco. So I think those are the sort of things that I really wanted to add. I think I've stopped sharing. Yes, I have. I went on a bit. Sorry, Florian.
No, that's fine. And then I would like to follow up with a question. What exactly do you mean with this tension? Do you mean that some public health experts are then more advocating the approach of focusing on demand and supply, and some others are focusing on harm reduction? Is this the tension that you mean, that we are just not agreeing with each other or not listening to each other enough? Or how would you see this? Or what would be a solution to resolve this tension?
I think the leadership on e-cigarettes came out through Public Health England. And I'm not sure how many people were involved in providing that leadership, but they certainly used this illicit drug policy concept of harm reduction, persuaded others that actually we can have less smoking, less harmful smoking, if we are using e-cigarettes. And they used a figure of, my recollection is 95% less harmful. But the figure has now we now understand it was not based on any evidence whatsoever. It was a group of people sitting around the table and agreeing to it, which included, by the way, tobacco company. But harm reduction is a really important element of all drug policy, but it can't be by itself. And I think that's the limitation, and that's where the tension is. So some people have picked up this harm reduction, saying, really, people who are not caught by the tobacco companies, but have this concept. So within public health, there were those people who got underway with this concept and went, we can have less people smoking. They'll be using e-cigarettes, but they won't be smoking. I think it's smoking either way, and they like to use the word vaping. I don't. I use the word e-cigarette. And that's because I don't want to go with the tobacco companies as part of their sales gimmick, if you like, or their marketing strategy. So yeah, there is a tension there. There are good people in public health who are looking at people who have smoked for a long time and who have stopped smoking, and so they're focused on the individual, rather than the really important thing where public health does is focus on populations. So how can we get our populations smoking less? Look, the reality is Costa Rica, Mexico, Brazil, Canada, US, Australia have all reduced smoking levels down to around 10%. And, from 80% after World War II. It can be done. The best way to give up smoking is to give up smoking. Is cold turkey. That's what the majority of evidence shows. But each person's different. So each person is, when we go down to an individual level, and that's why we need to facilitate access to methods, whether it's chewing gum or patches or e-cigarettes, but not widely available to be used inappropriately.
And of course, like one big topic of discussion, and what you also mentioned before, that some strategies might have been similar like strategies in the past. How do you see then the role of the youth? Because there's of course a concern that e-cigarettes are used by the youth, especially in the United States, but I'm not sure how this is in Australia. So maybe you can tell us a bit more about your perspective on this aspect.
Our government, federally, and our opposition have been very strong on e-cigarettes. They have listened to public health expertise, and certainly I was one of the strong advocates along the lines that I just illustrated. And by the way, that explanation is published in the American Journal of Public Health Policy a few years ago, about harm minimization being the overarching thing, with supply reduction, demand reduction, and harm reduction. What we've seen in Australia is a government that has so far banned nicotine in e-cigarettes, and have announced that they will go to a pharmacy-style regulation. and that the opposition has been agreeing with them. And I think it was that good advocacy work that has put a lot of time, and a strong minister as well, because don't forget, the tobacco companies are there as well. There is something else that I think that's really worth mentioning, and that is that the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control has been an absolute disaster for the tobacco companies. They know that it keeps them out of the sort of influence they have on government, if governments are abiding by it. And it varies, but by and large, it's not too bad. And now they're trying to use e-cigarettes to get around that and say, no, we don't. So it's the same companies, but for them, it's also a method of getting around that. And I think we have to be aware of that sort of strategy as well, and understanding. I mean, the biggest understanding of tobacco industry strategies has come from the legal discovery of documents in the United States, and what the tobacco companies were saying publicly and what they're actually doing intentionally. And of course, there's a movie about it, Thank You for Smoking, which actually goes through these in a really lighthearted way, and really makes the message clear as to what tobacco companies really are doing.
Yeah, and you also mentioned that Australia and some other countries, that your prevalence of smoking is actually already getting very, very low, up from very high numbers in the last decades. And in your publication, which I read together with Martin McKee and Mike Dobb, you're also mentioning that some of these countries, or some advocates in these countries, are thinking about the concept of the end game of tobacco, like to reduce the smoking prevalence to a very, very tiny percentage. Do you see this coming in Australia? Are some advocates focusing on this? Is this like the long-term vision for some people or organizations? Or is this something which is very much delayed with the debate on e-cigarettes at the moment? Or how would you see this?
There have always been those with long vision can see the end game of basically no smoking. And I say basically no smoking. I think if we had less than 5% smoking, I think we would say we are a non-smoking country. We would still continue to work harder. The fault we can't fall into is going for full prohibition, because prohibition creates corruption and organised crime and a whole run of other things. So we have to be very careful, and we might get attention in public health in that way as well. But I think we can certainly get to 5%. I think Costa Rica is already. I just looked today at some international figures, and I'm pretty sure that Costa Rica is the one that's leading. They've had some great health ministers. I'm not quite sure what it is about that country, but you know, to do it is to continue the sorts of strategies that we've been using all the way along, which is, we know price plays a really important part. And so taxation is important. And you've got to balance. If you move it too quickly, then you do create black markets. So you've got to have policing from customs and so on. But at the same time, we really have to make sure we keep the campaigns going on about what smoking does to you. And look, smoking now, basically somebody in this country who's smoking is really almost a social pariah. You know, people look down on somebody who's smoking. And this is in marked contrast when I go to Geneva, before COVID, when I could go to Geneva. And, you know, I'd go to sit outside in summer because that way I get fresh air, but you can't, because people could smoke outside. So you have to go back into the inside in the restaurant. So it always strikes me strongly when I'm in Geneva that, interestingly, the home of the World Health Organization, that and also the home of Japan Tobacco, that we need to take action there. But look, it's an end game. I think we can get there, and I think we've got to keep going on the same sort of strategies. People will come up with more creative ideas, and this is, though, being undermined by the tobacco companies in terms of e-cigarettes, because the argument is, look, you can smoke vape these things, because it's not really smoking. But what we're knowing from more and more research is that on the one hand, the people who have been smokers who are vaping are also smoking, in quite high proportion. We also know that it exposes young people, your teenagers, because they go, well, this is not smoking. And of course, that's the marketing message. For the tobacco companies, Phoenix rising from the ashes, just filter it. Then it'll be all okay. They knew it wasn't going to be okay. And it's the same. So it's just the same strategies again and again.
Okay. Yeah, and we are unfortunately almost at the end, but I would have like one last question. But before, there's also like one other question from the audience I would like to ask you, which was also about credibility, a topic you mentioned before, but now about the credibility of research and of researchers. It's the question by Karina, and she was seeing an anti-science sentiment rising.
Yeah.
Her perspective that some minority political parties and some vested interests and some individuals in society are undermining the credibility of science and of scientists. So how do you see this, or which advice do you have to researchers to keep the credibility of science high also in the eyes of politicians and the public?
Look, I'm going to be political now. The deputy leader of the free world is one of those people who just, that's Donald Trump. He just leaves science aside, and he and his and the evangelists that support him aren't interested in science. They're interested in belief. Whereas the leader of the free world, Angela Merkel, does base what she's doing on science. And we saw that with COVID, the contrast between the two of them with their responses to COVID-19. I mean, that was a huge challenge that for politicians, and it really brought out the politicians who are able to handle these things. The difference is that was a crisis, an emergency, and politicians can respond to emergencies. The trouble with tobacco and alcohol and diet related illnesses is these things happen slowly. And so it's much harder to get governments to react. And that's why in that, when I put up that first slide with the advocacy steps, is create a sense of urgency, because this is going on, and how many people are dying? Well, actually, a lot. Whereas when you have a better examples, food, more people are dying from obesity and overweight and heart disease than are dying from an outbreak of salmonella. But you watch how rapidly governments respond to an outbreak of salmonella. They're very good at it. Yes, but governments are not good at responding to things that are happening slowly, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and my last question actually would be, especially because you were in such a unique position of being a researcher, policymaker, and politician, what would be your advice on one hand for politicians? How can politicians get more closer to researchers and to use research better? And also, how can researchers or advocates get more involved with politicians and politics to make the work and the findings more relevant? So what would be your advice from your position?
The way I started, I had in the back of my mind I needed to say something, and you've raised it important. Very important, because politicians rely on their researchers, particularly if you're a minister, and then you rely also on your department to do that research. So it's a really important, maybe the first relationship you build up with is a staffer for a member of parliament or a minister. Phone up and say, who is it that looks after health for you as a member of parliament? Oh, it's Fred Bloggs. Okay, may I speak to Fred? Fred, can I make an appointment to see you, because I have some research that I think will be very helpful when you're writing the speeches for the minister, or when you're writing the speeches for a lowly member of parliament who's just been elected. The other element, I guess, is one where it's a long-term game. You try to pick the members of parliament who you think are going to advance in the political parties and are likely to become ministers or shadow ministers, and you provide them with information and you build up a relationship. And you know, the relationship doesn't have to be fake. Often you actually quite enjoy dealing with these people and enjoy the engagement, because you as a researcher have this amazing amount of information. You spend a huge amount of time looking at evidence, dismissing things, making sure you're not cherry picking, and whereas actually as politicians, and I must say I was guilty of this from time to time before I did my master's degree, was the cherry picking of evidence. So yes, I want to do an argument. I Google, oh, there we are, grab that. Researchers, any reasonable researcher, not even a good researcher, reasonable researcher, is very careful about cherry picking, and I think that's one of the things that we have to be very careful of in Parliament, and to be able to counter somebody who's cherry picking the evidence as well. Yeah. And you know, there's a personal element when you're enthusiastic about something. It's sometimes very difficult to look at the evidence from the other side, but it is very important.
Yes, I agree. Yeah. And is there some other last message you would like to give us to the audience on Facebook or later on YouTube? Or
look, I think people who are listening to this are involved in tobacco policy, so they know the range of things that are going on. But don't hesitate to also get in touch with successful advocates in your own country. And there's a little story I'd like to tell. There was somebody wrote to me when I was president of the World Federation of Public Health Associations, concerned about their government changing their policy on tobacco and affecting youth. And in that role, I wrote to the Chancellor of Austria, "Oh, Florian, that was you." Yes, and that's how we met. And look, you know, in the end, that was a great piece of advocacy, and I assume I was one of a number of people, because you were building the coalition of the willing. And we wrote, and I happen to have another connection in Austria, because that's how the world works. And so we were able to build up a relationship with a member of parliament from Austria. So, you know, all those things work together. So as a researcher, when you've got this idea and you see something wrong, you bring the evidence to bear, you go out and find people who may have some advocacy experience. And in particular, for those who don't know about your email group, they should send an email to you, and they can do it through the World Federation of Public Health Associations, or Google you, and get on this list, the email list you've got.
National Public Health Advocates. So we have lively debates there as well.
And they throw great ideas there, and you can contact people in your own country who you can work with. I mean, I think it's a brilliant idea. It's just building that same set of relationships and your coalition.
Yeah, then thank you very much. So I think this was a wonderful discussion and very insightful, inspiring, and I think also it was achieving our aims of being educational and also practical for advocates in this way. And yeah, thank you very much for your time and for sharing your advice and experiences. And
I was just trying to be entertaining.
For sure as well.
I think we can have a sense of humour too.
So greetings from
thanks, Florian. And thanks for those people who've watched and engaged as well.
Exactly. Yeah. So
I think it's fair to say that this will also be published on the website of the World Federation of Public Health Associations. So if you know somebody who wanted to see it and missed it, then they'll be able to go to WFPHA.org and look at it, and probably in the next few days, certainly in the next week.
Exactly, and we will share it on YouTube as well, so it will be easy to access for everyone afterwards.
Yeah, and keep working on Twitter.
Yes.
and other social media as well.
Okay. Thank you very much. Bye bye. Have a good day.